I want to thank the Dallas Historical Society for the privilege to be here tonight and to talk about an individual who I've come to sort of learn about over the course of my life and career and has assumed a kind of heroic stature. But before I jump into all of that, I want to thank some very accomplished historians that you see here: Virginia McAllister, Carol Wark, a teaching colleague out at UT Arlington, Kate Holliday, Max Levy, real enthusiast of Olmstead and by default Kessler, and my business partner and wife at Kevin Sloan's studio, Diane Sloan. You know, for me, principally as a practitioner who designs and builds places and spaces, history is an activity that adds knowledge to contemporary design, certainly our projects, and drawing is how that knowledge is acquired. Let me show you what I mean. Here I am in the Vatican Gardens. My wife took this photo. It's maybe about as many years ago as pounds, as you can kind of see here. And this is the drawing I made of this particular casino and garden in the Vatican sort of setting, really drawn from the perspective of looking at these elements from above. Here's an inventory of the skyline towers in Florence, where I lived and taught in accomplishing my Master's of Architecture with Syracuse. And Michelangelo taught me through drawing the correct proportions of a great public space. And note the paving pattern in this photograph. It's going to be very important to our discussion about George Kessler in a moment. Drawing Nantucket taught me that good town planning relates facades, the orientation of buildings, to the street pattern, sometimes symmetrically and other times asymmetrically. And I even learned and kind of internalized the great buildings of DFW by drawing them also. On the left, the Kimball Art Museum and Nasher, and a bay of the Swinbarden, here nearby the Hall of State on the right. And these lessons, these drawn lessons, you know, kind of materialize in our designs. It's somewhat of a mysterious process. But for example, the vertical repetition of the Uffizi informed the repetitive facade of a library I designed in North Dallas for Collin College. However, in response to the North Texas climate here, the Uffizi and its architectural origins was Texified. Here, the arcade becomes a kind of shaded device to protect the building south-facing from the Texas sun. And then on the inside, the proportions of the Palazzo Strozzi courtyard drawn on the right made the reading room seem like an exterior space that had been roofed over with an oculus, like you see here at the Pantheon. The Pulteney Bridge in Bath, England, taught me the elements of a splendid setting. And the program of elements needed to make that kind of setting became this setting in, of all places, our project in North Dallas known as Vitruvian Park in Addison. All the elements that are in the drawing on the right, at just a purely descriptive sense, the bridge, the kind of landmark bridge, the way the buildings orient their narrow end to the park, the islands, and so forth, essentially become the setting that you see on the left. This drawing of San Miniato al Monte, also in Florence, ended up on the cover of Landscape Architecture magazine, and it taught me, this particular drawing taught me how landscape elements that are new and introduced into a setting and disassociated with each other, the terraces, the steps, the belvedere, in the foreground can be composed against a facade in the background. That is exactly the problem I faced when, after helping SMU earn the George W. Bush Presidential Center to the campus, I was privileged to win the commission to design the Centennial Quadrangle. And here is that problem of essentially introducing disassociated elements in front of a monumental facade. Here, the Cooper Fountain that you see kind of mirrors the repetition of the portico, the two elements of the program, and then that leaves the Centennial Pavilion the opportunity to suspend itself as the kind of organizing object of the space. Inside, the pavilion contains a celestial dome of hand-painted stars arranged to match the September 17, 1911 sort of date that SMU was founded. It was hand-painted by a local Dallas architect, an artist, Chris Arnold, who lives in Oak Cliff. At that time, he was my next-door neighbor. And the idea for that celestial dome came from the old sacristy by Brunelleschi right there. You know, whenever I share this, especially as you might imagine in a time of, very, very interesting architectural pyrotechnics, sometimes not so interested in history, I got to ask, do these kind of lessons, does the gravitas of them really, are they really perceivable? Does that kind of content come through? And I think so, because in the case of the Centennial Pavilion, there's something about it that inspired this young man to present a rather important question to his soon-to-be fiancée and then send me these pictures with his gratitude for providing the place. Really a stirring moment, as a professional. Sometimes our interpretations of history aren't far from the source. Here is the bishop's table at Villalante, which becomes a kind of urban object, a kind of social condenser, as a fountain table that you see on the right. And I understand from the leasing agents at Vitruvian Park that the parties between the tenants that happen around this, maybe much like the kind of bacchanals that used to happen at the Villalante, are quote-unquote epic and legendary. Here's another one that's much sleeker and simpler that we did off of the Katy Trail. And as a landscape architect, I draw plants to memorize their characteristics. And I still do this activity. This wasn't something done to earn a master's degree. Here I am on a recent trip to Malta. This is not an activity that I started late in life. In fact, it was the spaces and the places of my youth that I experienced growing up in Kansas City as a boy that cultivated my awareness of the environment around me and later an interest in architecture and landscape. Let me share a few of these places in Kansas City and come along with me for just a couple more minutes because this is all going to make a lot of sense in just a second. My parents would take my sister and I to a place called Swope Park. At 1,800 acres, it was over twice the size of New York Central Park, which is about 880. The main shelter house that you see here majestically commands a 30-acre open great lawn where my father and I and other families would fly kites, sometimes model airplanes. Our picnics would happen in buildings that were shaped and inspired by Greek temples. And the same for the 8,000-seat Starlight Theater, also in Swope Park, where my parents once took me to see Yul Brynner in a play called The King and I. I vaguely remember someone kind of loud and charismatic running around on stage without a shirt, but for me, I was more intrigued by those towers. Dad, who lives up in those? Can we ever get a tour to go up inside of those? This was one of many public spaces in Kansas City. And then there was a complete network of beautiful boulevards like the Paseo that were charmed with garden structures like you see here, that were also many of our choices for where to go on a Sunday afternoon for a picnic. A place known as Penn Valley Park contained baseball fields where I learned to hit a curveball, sort of, and in between at bats, I would daydream about the bronze statue of the scout who looked down upon us from above. The parkways in Penn Valley were beautiful, and they just seemed to effortlessly grace and descend through the landscape and the ravine, and then eventually, in this occasion, connect to the Union Trace Station, where my mother and I would wait for her mother, or my grandmother, in the Great Hall for a weekend visit. Later in life, when I began to draw and study architecture seriously, I began seeing traces of these places in and around the world. For example, in Rome, this fragment of the Basilica of Maxentius seemed to be an obvious kind of reference for what later becomes Union Station and how it sits in relationship to the city there. My father He even kept a railroad schedule handy so that kind of mysterious at night, 11 o'clock or so, everybody get up, we've got to go over to the train station because the super chief was coming through. All these miracles were happening as a consequence of the city and how it was put together. I remember the trolley that connected Kansas City, Kansas to Main Street in Kansas City, Missouri. My father worked in that tall, blonde, beige building that you see on the right. This is the Main Street where most of the commerce at that time was concentrated. And nearby, the Lewis and Clark Overlook, just 2 blocks away. On weekends, we'd park here, again with some food packed in hand, to watch the airplanes. These fabulous, at that time in the early 60s, propeller-driven craft, and these new machines that were jet-powered, land and take off and pass us by at eye level. And it was only in recent years that I realized that that curious paving pattern was coming from Rome and the Campidoglio. For me, entertainment and family life unfolded in the city. It didn't unfold at home in a very extravagant entertainment center. Entertainment was provided by the public spaces that were at hand. And I took it for granted growing up here that every city must have these kinds of places and experiences to enjoy. What I learned quite later in life, these all weren't the result of just happy accidents. What I learned, even in preparing this lecture, is that all these memorable places and landscapes of my youth were planned by George Kessler. You know, his work is evidence. It's absolute evidence and a demonstration for how planning can grace everyday life and inspire future generations like me to notice the world around you because it has been so deliberately put together, and to also take care of it, if not be inspired to extend it. So we're going to begin here, because we can't really understand Kessler in Dallas without understanding Kessler in Kansas City, which came first and established his kind of cultural mind. He was known in his time as a landscape gardener, now something that we would call a landscape architect. And I think this is important because his city planning came as an outgrowth and was driven by making networks of parks and boulevards. A distinction that we were talking about before the lecture between Olmstead and Kessler is where Olmstead was a great maker of public and majestic landscapes. Kessler did that, but he was also a city planner. He used landscape to drive city form. For example, in planning Penn Valley Park, shown here on the right, he laid the groundwork for the future edition of the United States National World War I Museum, which, in my opinion, is one of the most extraordinarily sited buildings in the United States. It sits up not only on a hill, but it sits in a perfect relationship to the sun, where the city that the war fought and the heroes died for, that it protected, is clearly visible beyond the podium of the memorial's datum. You arrive and you descend down through the landscape like you're entering a kind of magnificent and monumental Verdun trench, and you encounter these bronze munition doors where you go through this windowless facade into a majestic double-height volume where you encounter a glass bridge that spans a mock field of Belgian poppies, each one representing 9,000 soldiers that perished in the war. And I would encourage you all to go there. It is really worth the trip to Kansas City because the exhibits are superb. Obviously, World War I was going on in history 100 years ago right now. Here in this exhibit, you can see how one cannon looks like it came from Jules Verne. The other one looks like a kind of holdover from the Civil War. Here's an exhibit and a collection of hand-drawn and painted messages to home. And on historical dates, with respect to the war, they bathe the tower in bloodlight. It's a powerful, powerful moment. And so, you know, even though Kessler, of Germanic origins, had a certain kind of problematic moment in this time to cite the National World War I Museum, the way he had structured the parks and boulevard system made this architecture possible. The point here is that had Kessler not done what he did in advance, putting the armature of places where they really needed to be that prefigured all these things, there would not be this amazing, amazing national treasure. To give you a sense of what a fully realized Kessler Park is like, we'll take a second and look at Roanoke Park, which is one piece of the overall master plan. Here you see it here, kind of coursing through what appears to be the edge of a residential subdivision sort of neighborhood. It's on the western side of downtown Kansas City, Missouri. This is where the topography begins to fall off rather dramatically and go into the river bottomlands where the stockyards are. I think we would all admit that on paper it looks like nothing. Just some green shapes of amorphic definition, but that's because Kessler was a real spatial thinker. It wasn't only about two dimensions and horizontal relationships, it was about the spatial relationship of the individual, a very personal idea moving through the park. The road enters against the prow of a hill. This is the way it was in Kessler's time. It's the way it is now. You enter against the prow of the hill. Notice, as the road turns to the left, the view extends out to the right. It's like a counter move spatially. You then ascend up a kind of graded hummock. All this is part and parcel of his prowess as a landscape architect. And now the view pivots from the right to the left. It's like a tremendous kind of fulcrum that comes over and goes into this deep pocket over here. Much of the vegetation is still like it was when Kessler structured the spaces of the plan. Then there's a moment of mystery. You're following the foot, the toe of the bluff slope, and then suddenly the main space is presented. Notice how he situated this park and the main playfield in space. So it's like a room. It's like the trees and the bluff and the 40 to 60 foot of falls, almost 70 foot actually. Here actually frames this space like it's a room. The moves that he does are so simple. And I thought about this for a long time because in many ways, when you see Olmstead's landscapes, especially all the dynamiting he had to do in New York Central Park, it's much more invasive, it's much more forceful. Kessler's parks seem to almost materialize effortlessly, as if they laid themselves out onto the land, and they're in such a kind of simple way, they prefigure all the future forces that could essentially scuttle them. I mean, the soccer fields come, the soccer fields go, the sand volleyball pits, and but the structure and the spatial armature remains. It's the space to Kessler with the garden that is important. Now, what's interesting, somewhat anecdotally, and also we were talking about this before our occasion, is sometimes I feel with this discovery of Kessler in my hometown that something's guiding me around, because the largest commission I ever earned was in Kansas City. I had the privilege of winning, and I talked about Kessler and the Kansas City Parks and Boulevards Network to win the Sprint World Headquarters campus, which, according to the Wall Street Journal, was the largest construction project in the United States for 2 consecutive years. They co-located 14,000 employees rather than move them to Dallas, which I'm sure there have been many people with their business cards ready to design that headquarters. But Sprint decided to stay in Kansas City. And I decided to take my knowledge, my kind of awareness of Kansas City, the parks, not Kessler the person, to shape, for example, how I did this parkway. But in our time, it is surrounded by ecological grasses, but the same kind of curbless impulse is coming from that legacy, and deliberately so, to extend that provenance into the designs of the spaces and garden places I'm making here. In brief, I can say that this garden amphitheater comes from many of the Kessler gardens that I could point to at Loose Park and others. The brick that you see here is actually the Kansas City stockyard brick that was repurposed. Kessler had a reverence certainly for not only making history, but history that preceded him. And that, you know, to any historian in the know, materials are constantly being repurposed from one generation to another. And so it was quite an interesting conversation with the CEO of Sprint to sort of say that now that his company is the single employer in Kansas City, perhaps he has an obligation to preserve these brick from being sold off for suburban patios as they were being done by buying them all and moving them to the campus, which they did. This is a view of the grotto fountain in the main quadrangle. What the people there, the employees, all 14,000 of them, have kind of coined the town square. And here is the historic garden stair that kind of descends to and across it. So individuals going from an everyday moment of one meeting to another experience a landscape like this. The spring grove in front of the headquarters building is a kind of nod to sort of apple orchards that one might have seen Kessler do in some of his other landscapes around North America. And Kessler himself actually launched the legacy that Kansas City would eventually become known as a city of fountains. The Chamber of Commerce, still to this day, likes to say that there are as many or more fountains in Kansas City as there are in Rome. I don't know if anyone's ever counted them, but we'll take them for granted. This fountain extends that history, and Kessler also designed spaces for all four seasons. This kind of moody winter scene in the birch grove clearly originates from several things I could point to that he designed in and around Kansas City, Missouri. The campus perimeter, though, in this time is a 100-acre belt of ecological grasses that have naturalized, with a wetland at the low point, which is also the watering source for the entire campus. After 15 years now that the Sprint campus has been working, the practicality of using the wetland to water the campus has essentially created a situation where they've never had to buy 1 gallon of water to irrigate the campus, which is great ecologically, but the corporate sort of executives like the fact that it has preserved $7 million in operational costs. You know, given the influence of George Kessler on my life and design work, I have to wonder, who was he? From where did he come? He was born in Frankenhausen, Germany, to parents who presided over a land estate and land trust. His father, Edward, immigrated to the United States in 1865. I think oftentimes we think of George Kessler and we locate him in our imagination somewhere right at the turn of the century. We have to visualize he appears as a young boy right after the Civil War in the United States. And after bouncing around and trying different occupations in New Jersey and St. Louis, he even went up to Racine, Wisconsin with the family. Where does he eventually land? He settles in, of all places, the quote-unquote wild frontier town of Dallas, Texas. What was described then as a raw town at the end of civilization. Old habits die hard, yes. He's in his mid-teens at this point, but he's working as a bill collector, probably something that came in handy when he became a practicing planner and landscape architect. We're somewhere in the vicinity of 1877. He worked at Sanger Brothers clothing store when it first opened, and then his father died in Dallas, and I've always wondered where Edward Kessler is buried. I haven't found it. Keep your eyes open. And after his father passed, his mother and sister suggested, this is another one of these miraculous moments, that if you put your mind back in that time, you know, they say to young George, who apparently was demonstrating a creative proclivity for the visual arts, that he should leverage those and become a landscape architect in 1877. Do you understand that probably the individuals who would refer to themselves as a landscape architect at that time, you could probably count on one hand in the entire all of North America? How did his mother and sister sort of know to direct it? But they did, and they took themselves and young George in 1876 back to the old world to get him educated. And what an education it is and was. In Weimar, he got a job here at this great ducal garden, studying forestry, botany, and landscape design. I mean, you understand that if you want to be a landscape architect in 1877, there's no school of it. There's no curriculum. How do you become this? You have to invent. He's inventing his education with the help of, obviously, a very erudite and conscientious mother. He then jumps that position and he goes and works in the park an der Ilm, which is also where Goethe lived. And Goethe influenced the design of the garden. Imagine the lessons that he begins to internalize here. Here's Goethe's house and garden, which remains today as part of a World Heritage Site. His next stop in his education is briefly at the Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin, and then at the Polytechnicum, which was considered the premier horticultural library in Germany. He studies at the Gartner Jahranstalt. My Italian's better than my German, as you can tell, in Potsdam, and then at the Gartner Lehranstalt, a school of garden design in Europe that was so sought out. It was located here at the New Palais in Potsdam, and Kessler makes it one of his many stops on his journey towards being a landscape architect. If we look closer at this part of the New Palais, these twin towers where he studied, and the preceding terraces, we might begin to see traces of what later becomes the shelter house at Sloan Park. To cap off his education, Kessler completes his study by concentrating on a degree in civil engineering at the University of Jena. He's 21 years old at this point, and now he's ready to go back to America. And he does, and he takes a job with a Mr. A. Lumont in the Bowery. What I know about Mr. A. Lumont is he's, a rising industrial, very wealthy, well-to-do man. And the job that Kessler has is basically tending his private residence and garden, where he's kind of in charge of the greenhouse and the seed stock. But he also takes a second part-time job. He starts to learn who are the people in New York that he now needs to get to know, and they need to get to know him. And he begins to correspond. He's not working for, he corresponds with Frederick Law Olmstead. Realize at this time New York is a much smaller town, and so the cultural milieu there would have been very easy to figure out, to sort of identify, and Olmstead was certainly one part of it. And in that correspondence, what's legendary to those who might want to dig into the archives is Olmstead, almost a kind of quintessential pedant, is constantly making grammatical corrections to Kessler's Germanic kind of English. But Olmstead does even more than that. He encourages him to expand his horizons, writing, and essentially encouraging him that his study and practice, as so far indicated, has been rather modest and linked to small pleasure grounds, with a consistent, through which consistent broad effects may eventually elude him. I don't mean to, and he goes on to say, I don't mean to sort of sound indecorous, but only to urge you to be ambitious and to be a master in higher fields. This is how people used to write to each other back in those days before text messaging. Which is what young George begins to consider. He also does something else, which is extraordinarily shrewd. He studies Olmstead. He doesn't just study him as a landscape architect. He studies him as a cultural personality. And he realizes, if you look at that list, all of Olmsted's acquaintances, William Vanderbilt, William Cullen Bryant, significant newspaper editor, George Putnam, publisher, other acquaintances, architects, poets, Longfellow, and so forth. He's observing Olmsted's network and kind of his cultural kind of influences, so that when he goes to Kansas City, he gets Olmstead of sorts to recommend, well, what do I do? And Olmstead gets him a commission and a job to move here to Kansas City, which was at that time a burgeoning boomtown of only about 55,000 people. At the time of Kessler's arrival, the city had no paved streets. This is what's so extraordinary is, our view of history, especially when we look at it in retrospect, we would think, oh, Kansas City had sewer. It had no sewer, no sidewalks, no sewer system. The economy was driven by two things, railroads and the stockyards, which you can see over here in the river bottoms. Here's a view of the kind of a colorized postcard of what that economic motor, of that time was. It was a vast geography. It must have been just an incredibly formidable environment if you think about it. But the job Olmstead recommended Kessler for wasn't in Kansas City, per se. It was actually in and out here in this distant suburb known as Merriam, Kansas. Kessler leaves New York to go to Merriam, Kansas. What in the world is in Merriam, Kansas that would ever compel him to think that there was something worth his future? And the answer was simple. There was a railroad company. Ambition followed the railroads at that time, and a railroad company wanted to build one of these new phenomenons known as a park around its railroad stop. That's what Kessler went to do. And what he unleashes at this young age, after all of this pent-up study and education, is a remarkable. Unfortunately, none of it exists today. The park, here's what it included. It included a large open-air shelter. It had a lake, numerous picnic grounds, tennis and croquet courts, a merry-go-round, a baseball diamond, animal exhibits, almost like a zoo, and just profusions. There's just tremendous writing about the profusions of flowers. And here's the thing. It was so popular, you had to pay to go to it. Admission was 25 cents. And then it became so popular, you had to make a reservation to pay your 25 cents. So it's an extraordinary kind of demonstration of design and a cultural reaction. And as you might imagine, in a prospering town, such a kind of production then is seen as something that others want. This was his breakout success moment, which then leads to planning Hyde Park, a luxury kind of neighborhood and park, which was next. Houses in Hyde Park, here's some pictures I took just within the last couple of years, were given kind of a pattern language, which he also determined that included lots of asymmetries to produce kind of casual relationships between the house and the street. Here's a satellite view of that. See how he uses the landscape as a driver to sort of frame the Hyde Park neighborhood. He's not going to do this piece here, and that's going to be very important. Here's the park, which he essentially drapes over the topography and the slopes, which was very interesting. It also provided an identity and a definition. And he integrates the streets and the parks with the other existing infrastructure to the north. However, for some interesting reason, he doesn't get the commission to design that block, which is known as Janssen. It was designed by another architect. And this architect was entirely enamored with the Chicago Exposition and the formal structure of that. He designs a street that is absolutely symmetrical, and all the houses that line it are symmetrical. In contrast to the kind of casualness of what Kessler produced, Janssen Place never attracted a second act. No other people came calling for another version of Janssen Park, whereas Kessler's Hyde Park took off and almost became the kind of raison d'etre of Kansas City in one commission after another. And as you might imagine, someone of this success naturally attracts, and they say, why don't we have young George, this time now in his late 20s, plan the entire city, an entire network of Hyde Parks, boulevards, and neighborhoods. And here is his Kansas City Parks and Boulevards master plan that you see here. At this point, he's nationally known. The world is coming to him in Kansas City. And look, you can't read this, and that was intentional. Here are the commissions that he does between Merriam Park and Fair Park in 1907. Here's 1883, 1907, and he does all of these projects between them. Without a fax machine, without modern technology, or a laptop. You know, and the list includes some astonishing things like the 1904 World's Fair in Paris. All of that brings us then here, to home, to the plan he does for Dallas, which was done at the height of his prime and notoriety, but also other projects are competing for his time. And that has to be thought about because of what he faces here in Dallas as a set of problems. It isn't all automatic. It isn't all a kind of technique that he has worked out, and he just goes from one city to another to sort of drape the same kinds of sensibilities onto the land. You know, to begin with, the 1910-11 Dallas plan extended some planning work he did here for Fair Park in 1904. For George Dealey, was just sorting out some kind of orientations with some of the infrastructure, the tree-lined sort of boulevard you see on the left, some of the stadium and entertainment facilities you see on the right, and that kind of ingratiated him to the city fathers, so that by the time the need for a city plan materialized, it was obvious that they were going to go back and knock on George Kessler's door. The master plan in Dallas addressed 9 issues. Listen to what they are. Establishing levees, tame the flooding Trinity. Establishing a belt railroad, a belt line. Designating a Union Station for civic arrival and departure, and a complimentary freight terminal. A civic center, resolving a lot of problematic grade crossings between railroads and streets that were fatal problems for, unfortunately, several people in Dallas. And then he gets to parks, parkways, boulevards, and playgrounds. It's a master plan that is favoring almost the mind of a municipal engineer first, and then the landscapes of the boulevards are in service to those bigger moves. Here's a list you can see maybe on the right, a little bit more. Levees, the Belt Railroad, Union Station, freight terminals. You can almost get the sense that his interpretation of Dallas, even at that moment, was as a great regional distribution center. Getting the railroads to work and protecting them from the floods was somewhat the a priori, and although this photograph isn't exactly taken at that time, it's pretty close. You can see the courthouse here. You can see this kind of snarl of railroads coming along here following a common topographic point, the mess of the unpredictability of the floodplain and so forth. He arrives, he comes back to his boyhood town, sees this and says, levees come first. And they did. Here we see what they look like. Sometime in 1930, probably an early kind of Air Force bomber testing some aerial photography takes this picture. You can see the meanders, which is now the design district, running through warehouses that essentially were liberated and protected by the levees, their establishment, shoving them to the west. We didn't extend an urban and street infrastructure that was civic. We actually used the recovery of that floodplain for warehousing. That's quite an interesting thing, that given that opportunity, did they build the next piece of an American Paris? We were interested in making goods and shipping them, getting them on the railroads, and that's what that new land was for. He mapped all the existing open spaces in Dallas, a rather modest kind of exercise, as you can see here. And he proposed knitting them together like he sort of did in Kansas City with landscape boulevards. But here you can see him in some ways dealing with a completely different physical and spatial. Dallas is a fractured sort of set of grids. Different established sort of land rights took hold. It's not the elegant kind of grid situated to a main street like he had in Kansas City. So he's got different orientations. He's got Oak Cliff separated by this, rather contentious river and so forth. And he tries to sort of lasso it all with the boulevard. They go out to White Rock Lake. He certainly recognizes that as a performative piece of infrastructure that can also be part of its kind of garden apparatus. He's dealing with a problem here of a city that had no regard for being knitted, that now needs to be knitted as Dealey and the city fathers so aspired. And then he does kind of what we might call today urban acupuncture, where, railroads and trolley crossings were just fatal relationships. There's just legions of stories of important people who were killed because they, basically got hit by a trolley. And he's attempting to resolve that retroactively, while he's also dealing with a rather unruly and kind of disorder. Look at the grid that starts out like this, and then it gets expanded, different proportion, then it gets rotated, unresolved collisions here. He must have thought Dallas was a real mess, that probably needed him, but again, his time is being pulled in lots of different directions. The map on the left identifies the Beltline rail. You can see it's like a big loop. And the flood control levees. This is the big infrastructure move. And on the right, there's a diagram for a network of parks and boulevards like he does. So the infrastructure establishes kind of the order, and then he drapes the parks and the boulevards onto it, which was unlike what he had to deal with in Kansas City, where no such similar problem. I mean, the Trinity River is, a ravine in comparison to the Missouri River and the Kansas, which come together in Kansas City. And he concluded his master plan with a budget and an estimate for future costs and current operations. He didn't just do a master plan very eloquently written and handled and then just kind of move on. Here is how it would be financed, managed, and the taxation it might need to keep it running. It's fascinating to go into this and kind of look at some of the costs. And then there's one more thing. The Kessler Plan Association prepared a book entitled Our City, Dallas by Justin Kimball in 1927. The book was used to teach what was once called civics to school children in Dallas. In other words, children in Dallas grew up not only learning that their city had a plan, but what the plan was, and they could imagine how their lives as future citizens would contribute and extend this plan. Little wonder that when there are public meetings today for planning projects, people are afraid. They've never encountered city planning before. They come and they worry that the new mixed-use development will overwhelm their neighborhoods with traffic or something. Here, school children were essentially cultivated to grow up and understand why planning is important and why what their city plan was and how they would eventually contribute to it. All this explains, and I think sets the stage for my interest in development and promotion of something I've been writing about. There was a major piece in the Morning News. The entire March issue of D Magazine, titled Wild Dallas, is devoted to this idea of the Branch Waters Network, which is taking and picking up where Kessler's plan left off and applying it to the entire 7 million acre metropolitan area of DFW, which is what I'll cover in the last couple minutes. What I'm calling the Branch Waters Network is a concept to use the nature of the entire watershed network in DFW as a natural attraction to aggregate and structure a future metropolitan-wide urbanism along the edges. Segments of this are already complete, and they were done by Kessler. Turtle Creek is a 100-year-old demonstration that nature can form culture, recreation, and high-rise living. Think about this. In the 60s, people in Dallas would live in a high-rise, a New York-like high-rise, because it was on Turtle Creek, when the good life was typically understood as a large house on a wide, sprawling, noble estate. This is the authority of what Kessler came up with at Turtle Creek. White Rock Lake, which he left us, obviously is a piece of that network, and there's pieces and parks all throughout DFW. This is one of our projects over in Fort Worth, which is actually going to be dedicated this coming Saturday as part of Earth Day, the Airfield Falls Conservation Park, very near Carswell Air Force Base. It will sport the display, this public display of a pair of wings and a tail section of a historic C-9 aircraft donated by the air base. Here's the display that was completed about 3 weeks ago. Here's the entrance to the park. Some of the light fixtures and the jet wing kind of hanging down so you could reach up and touch it when you enter. And as shades of that pavilion that I showed you on the Paseo in Kansas City, here is my all-steel painted offering originating from those childhood memories that will be at Airfield Falls. You'll be able to find the place because the two entrances are marked by windsocks. The Strand in Dallas is another water branch that's a recent kind of urban connection. There's now apartments that have been attracted and are under construction right here. And all that leads to hundreds of miles of other hike and bike trails that have dropped themselves into these greenways. But I think in focusing only on putting things in, we miss the larger opportunity that Kessler understood. It's not just a landscape, it's a landscape with the city and the urbanism on the side of it that is the project. And the potential to incrementally over time, since it's taken us 100-some years to get to this point in the next 100 years, to build a kind of citywide urbanism that's braided with nature. In satellite view, these water branches, they look like veins of a leaf running through DFW. Some of them are quiet, still waters like a bayou, and others are tunnels of shade with water flows. Even some are wild environments, absolutely rewilded. Within our city, wetlands. The branch waters can accept the plurality of American culture and development. All kinds of urbanism can develop along the sides of them, as Kessler's original Turtle Creek sort of demonstrated. Here's an illustration of mixed use, and here's another sort of example. You know, most cities now have a park. It's become quite fashionable to go out and hire a celebrity designer, and that designer's name gives your park distinction without necessarily understanding the ideas and the deeper American history of why that was an important process. I mean, even Louisville has, you know, one of these now. The branch waters is an idea of urbanism structured in making a city by nature. And here's what's really amazing as we kind of got into this, the research, the historical research, when some of my designers mapped the most obvious water branches. I mean, we take for granted our home. I mean, that's just what home is. But we never think that DFW is, you know, 60 miles across east-west and maybe 50 miles of continuous sort of incorporated civilization. If you map the most obvious water branches in a metropolis of that size, I won't tell you what the real length is because you won't believe me, but I'll tell you it's between, that what I will tell you is between 300 and 400 miles of these exist. And then you have two sides of them. Think about that as a cultural possibility. Think of that as a real estate possibility of what dedicating and giving a parent name to this entire watershed system would be, and its influence to all neighborhoods that the watershed network courses through. Did you know that some of them are actually springs? Our street names give them away. They're rather attractive. You know, under the Blackland Prairie and the Cross Timbers, they look like this. It's a rock shelf. Rain percolates down, it seeps in to where erosion then daylights it. But this is what we do to some of them. This is Cedar Springs. That water there is Cedar Springs spring water. Run for the hills. The spring water is coming. We need to over-engineer it and fence it off from the housing that might want to enjoy it. Or even worse, we abuse them. My firm took this one in North Dallas, which is Farmers Branch Creek, and in the same view turned it into this, which was a 19-acre spring-fed park that draws density. I mean, this is absolutely a suburban culture. And the park and the nature so demonstratively evident by Turtle Creek just naturally attracts kind of the high-rise living, it's actually mid-rise living to the park. We recently added an amphitheater to Vitruvian Park that opened with a salsa festival. I thought at first it was talking about the taco sauce, but I said, no, Kevin, it's a dance thing. They're all dancing on the terraces and then up on the balconies and in their living rooms. The urban reserve that my office planned and did the landscape for is another water branch project that's organized along the first biofiltering street in this part of America. Here's a view of that. White Rock Creek. There's the water branch, and here is essentially the urban reserve as a kind of offshoot of it. Some of the houses shown here nested into this lush kind of biofiltering landscape, and then at a metropolitan scale, the so-called Connected City Challenge we did with Pritzker Prize winning firm OMA and Mia Lair was also a water branch project as it went past downtown. Last minute, I want to talk about this, because all of this discussion about the Water Branch project obviously triggers questions of, well, Mr. Sloan, what would you do with this Trinity Park that's over by the Calatrava bridges? And how could the Water Branch's concept refine the thinking and maybe get something built? Let's talk about that as we conclude. The current proposal for the Trinity Park is for a highly designed, cultivated landscape. But unfortunately, that conceit is shared with a geography that exists, and Kessler determined to protect our city from flooding, as it did here for an entire month in June of 2015. But the idea of a dream lake excites us. When it appears, we all go out on the bridges and stare at the water. But Dream Lake eventually recedes, leaving a destroyed landscape. And enormous amounts of snags of bottles, baby strollers, and other sharp objects that probably families and their children might want to avoid. In my mind, if we think about this, and we're reminded of examples of Olmstead and Kessler and the landscapes, if one took that to the nth degree, there is a landscape that we could put out there that would be resilient and beautiful. It's the original landscape. A blackland prairie and wetland restoration, a nature project, would be beautiful and indestructible. It would also agree with all the migratory species that traverse the central flyway, the carotid artery of migratory species that goes right through DFW. Suddenly, we not only have an urban park, but we have nature and the creatures of it become the objects of admiration. And you know, urban wildlife is familiar to other world cities and their parks. I mean, the Parisians don't seem to mind that there's mallards in the fountains at the Louvre. But did you know that DFW is the #1 city in the world for the tagging, banding, and trapping of urban wildcats? Right now, there's 2 universities that have put radio collars on 35-pound bobcats, and they're following them up Turtle Creek through the mid-cities area. We have wildlife emerging inside of our metropolis. If you don't believe me, go home and pull up a search engine and type in Bobcat City and see what you get. You know, sometimes I think at this point, the world expects Dallas to want to copy whatever's going on in New York or Paris or maybe even Louisville. But you know, here's an opportunity to sort of learn from a deeper kind of understanding of history and show them all something that they'll never have. The contrast of this kind of landscape in walking distance to a downtown, a major world urban downtown, has no comparison anywhere else in the world. You know, Dallas is becoming a mega city, and every mega city has some characteristic and quality that cannot be replicated by any other city in the world. Perhaps this Branch Waters network could be ours. And I thank this man for all the inspiration that he gave to me. The phrase, crusade against ugliness, was in the introduction of the Kessler plan for Dallas. And I will say that in that kind of exalted, almost late 19th century rhetoric of, can you imagine a practitioner of architecture today actually standing up in front of the city council and saying, this is a crusade against ugliness? Maybe that needs to be said. But we're committed, I think, in our own way of extending that word. In fact, we're so committed that my office is in a building named after George Kessler, in the storefront of the Kessler Theater, which also happens to be less than 300 feet from my house in Winnetka Heights. We walk the talk, and we admire all of our heroes, from the ones we've drawn and the ones who shape our city and our heritage, like George Kessler. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, sir.
This is very interesting to me, but one thing just from the get-go, I noticed on his plan, you know, obviously there was White Rock Lake and Turtle Creek and the railroad station and the looping line, but it looked like that there was a boulevard system. Did any of that get built, or is any of that in place, or did it all not get put in? Or?
You know, it's interesting. I know what you're talking about. And in Oak Cliff, there are fragments of it that are still there. Anytime you encounter, and forgive me here, because as a visual person, I could drive us all right to what I'm talking about, but I can't tell you what the street name is. But just south of Davis, in that kind of North Oak Cliff, you suddenly encounter this odd street that has a wide median in it. It's in an otherwise kind of typical residence. That's a piece of Kessler's plan. Bishop Avenue, which was recently reworked to take the median out and put that dimension to the outside so they could have, that was one of Kessler's boulevards. So we undid that one so we could have our velo net and our bicycle net, you know, in more conventional terms. But the one piece that he did design that was materialized almost completely was Turtle Creek. And that's 7.5 miles. If you think about the fact that that was a 7.5 mile long kind of intervention, and that we're talking about a watershed system that is 99% mostly untouched in the same, at least in the same kind of way, you see the potential of what we're, you know, might be talking about here. It would be something that would be entirely unique. And it would just originate from a very, very, you know, talented and bright individual who got it all started back in the early part of the 20th century. Yes, sir.
You call it urban preserve, where you turn the river area to its natural. What kind of a chance do you think that stands?
What kind of chance? You know, if there's anything Kessler demonstrates for us, that the planner doesn't materialize the plan. The plan is materialized by other individuals. But I can tell you that there has been, with really the support of D Magazine, largely, Texas Architect, the full Sunday page. I'm also a writer for the Morning News. I wrote a piece about it. It seems to be touching people in a particular way that they can understand, you know, the kind of reconstituting this, something that is as close to the original landscape as possible. It cannot be the original landscape. I just recently had quite an interesting and lively discussion with a rather well-known landscape architect who's being considered to do something of a more kind of dramatic way around the two Calatrava bridges. And I said, look, you know, this is not a romance. You know, we understand that we can't have the Blackland Prairie back entirely, but it's about originating as close to a landscape that helps us recover the memory of that. We see it. We're convinced that that's what it is. And that landscape, you know, has the capacity already built into it as a riverine and a kind of pothole wetland to kind of handle all that stuff. You know, it comes in and settles out. It would be the cheapest, it would be the most resilient, and it would be the safest, and it also would be the most original way to handle that area of the Trinity.
The politicians would never buy into it.
Well, it's I don't know, because what I see and what I get in you know, if you read the comments whenever there's an article about this thing, they seem to be almost overwhelmingly positive for this idea, because it's kind of so intuitively obvious to do that. But there's other agendas out there, and you know, we'll just have to see, because it's a very complicated. It's a fork in the road for whether Dallas is going to follow the herd and say, we got to get us one of these fancied, you know, kind of landscapes like Houston or like some of these other cities who are very well in their right to do that, and misseeing the larger possibility that such a large geography rewilded like this would absolutely be one of the most original things ever conceptualized and realized, with a major contemporary downtown in walking distance to a nature preserve. Doesn't exist anywhere else. So do we really want to be world class, or do we want to follow the pack? Yes, sir.
What's the effect of running a tollway down through the river on the
I think it's utterly an insane and destructive idea. It doesn't make sense. The OMA project that I showed you, that rendering, that firm, which is the same firm that did the Wiley Multiform Theater, is really one of the most amazing firms analytically. They're very bright. It was a real privilege to be added to their team. They commissioned possibly, arguably, the world's best traffic planner to be part of that effort. It's a firm from Milan called Mobility and Chain, MIC. They do the urban traffic plan for places like Moscow and Milan and Rome. I mean, the traffic plans they do are just incredible. And after doing a wide area analysis of DFW, they determined that they couldn't see any reason why the tollway needed to be built. And so to, a firm originating from the Netherlands like OMA, you don't go out and build polders when they're not needed, or highways when they're not needed. If you just need a construction project, you don't need to negate the park in the process. So I'm already on on public record, that I was part of that competition we presented in the Horchow, that we really didn't see from a purely rational standpoint that the tollway was needed. So why are we talking about it? That's not up to me. It's up to a lot of you and how you voice your thoughts and so forth. But I certainly hope it won't, because I think the possibility that is at hand with what that park could be, even if it was done by a really fabulous celebrity designer like someone like Michael van Valkenburg, and what that could be versus the catastrophic, what I think, without too much hype, would be just an embarrassing kind of thing to do. We would go from possibly something that is very original in kind of the eyes of the world to something that would be a complete embarrassment. Like, what's wrong with Dallas? So I think that hopefully all that will sort itself out in the correct way. Yes, sir.
In order for the branch waters network to be adopted, what authorities need to back it? And as a follow-up to that, have you received any support from such authorities?
Great question. Because the one thing I hope that comes through is it's already building itself. Fort Worth, for Streams and Valleys in Fort Worth, has a large master plan. They're doing their thing. There is something called the Triangle, where it's a group of individuals who are doing a VeloNet connection to White Rock Lake in the north. So it's already happening. I thought about this to a great length, because all I want really, part of my intention is just to sort of identify that this is going on and make it a much more conscious objective. If we did that, then individuals who would pour their energies into, the White Rock Triangle or whatever that is, they would know that they're adding towards the construction of something bigger, that it wouldn't just sort of die after that, or maybe even, worst case, degrade. So, there have been a number of individuals and groups who have contacted me, who have actually offered, to kind of be the champions and of the project. And we're talking and sorting through some of those groups and their level of interest to sort. Really, what it comes down to is it could be as simple as just giving the watershed network a parent name. Just name it. Like the design district became something when it was named the design district. And I don't know if if anyone knows this, I would really appreciate if there was a proclamation or somebody that made it official, or if they just said, we're going to call ourselves a design district and that's it. Because it could be that simple on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there might need to be just the right amount of consideration so that the worst kind of things that could happen don't happen. So if there are volunteers out there, I've got plenty of business cards to sort of hand out and see if we can all get, because it's going to take a lot of people to sort of do something like this. What it really will take, I think, once the first piece, I think Dallas should be the first piece to do it. Dallas, City of Dallas, Dallas County, we're seen really as kind of the thought leader in the Metroplex. I think, like it or not. And if any community will start it, it will be Dallas. And then it could proliferate out of nothing more than kind of a friendly comp. Arlington will have theirs, and Fort Worth, and there it goes. Well, thank you. Oh,
Just one last thing.
Yes, sir.
Along the same lines, but how far, I thought they had a plan between the bridges to build the park. Is that still
that's the.
purely up in the air, or is that for real?
Well, I mean, I think what you've seen is that a group largely of private patrons have kind of coalesced to come forward with a plan designed by the very celebrated landscape firm from New York, Michael Van Valkenburg, MVVA. And, there is a great track record of how, private hands have done wonderful things in our city, and this is kind of that, I think, vein. The problem is, as I said, it's not just any kind of park that, where you transform a surface parking lot into an attractive environment. This is a floodway that exists from Kessler's time to make, protect our city, to make it safe. This can't just simply be seen as an aesthetic issue or an issue of, expressivity or all those kind of things. And so that plan is out there, and I would encourage you all to keep your eyes on the stories, all the stories, as they, proceed, because I think there's still a lot of discussion that will unfold. Thank you very much for your time, and good evening.